Every generation faces one moment, one specific, identifiable, historically singular moment, when the question of whether a particular line will or will not be crossed stops being a theoretical exercise for strategists and starts being the most consequential live question in international affairs. Previous generations faced that question in 1914, when the assassination of an archduke set in motion a sequence that nobody planned and everybody failed to stop. They faced it in 1938, when the question of whether a territorial concession would satisfy or embolden became the hinge on which the entire subsequent decade turned. They faced it in 1962, when 13 days of back-channel decision-making determined whether the nuclear age would end the world or simply terrify it into a more careful kind of coexistence. Our generation is facing it now. The line exists. It has been identified. Every serious government in the world has a classified assessment of what crossing it produces. And the near universal conclusion of those assessments is the same. If this specific line is crossed, the world order that has governed international relations since 1945 does not survive the crossing in recognizable form. My name is Professor Zhang Suechen, and if you want to understand where that line is, what crossing it actually produces across every dimension of the world you live in, and what the realistic prospects are for the crossing being prevented in the window that still remains, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now, because this is the scenario analysis that the current moment demands, and it is the analysis that no other framework currently being applied to this situation is producing with the clarity and the specificity that the stakes require. In this video, we are going to answer 3 precise questions. What is the line? What specifically constitutes its crossing? And why does this specific line carry world order consequences rather than merely regional or conflict-specific ones? Who are the decisive actors whose decisions in the current window determine whether the line is crossed or whether the conditions for crossing it are interrupted before they become irreversible? And from this point forward, what are the realistic scenarios? The world order reshaping scenario that crossing the line produces, the managed containment scenario that represents the best realistic alternative, and the strategic wildcard that could change the entire logic of the situation before the crossing becomes unavoidable. By the end of this video, you will have the clearest available picture of what the line crossing scenario actually looks like. Not in the abstracted language of strategic studies, but in the specific, concrete, domain-by-domain detail that allows you to understand what reshaping the world order actually means for the world you live in. Let us begin with the context reset, because understanding why this specific line carries world order consequences requires understanding what the world order actually is and how it has been maintained for the 8 decades since it was constructed. The post-war international order is not a set of rules written in a document. It is an architecture. A specific combination of military deterrence relationships, economic interdependency arrangements, institutional frameworks, and normative expectations that together create the conditions under which great power competition produces rivalry and friction rather than catastrophic conflict. The architecture has been stressed before. It has been violated in specific dimensions before, but it has never faced a stress whose specific character threatens not individual elements of the architecture, but the foundational assumptions on which the entire architecture rests. The line that this analysis is about is not a line within the architecture. It is a line beneath it. A line whose crossing would remove the foundational assumptions that allow the architecture to function as an order-maintaining mechanism rather than a war-producing one. Here is what has literally just happened that has brought the situation to the proximity of this specific line at this specific moment. The combination of developments that has accumulated over the preceding period has produced a condition that the post-war architecture was specifically designed to prevent, a condition in which a major power has concluded, based on a rational assessment of its strategic situation, that the expected cost of accepting the current trajectory exceeds the expected cost of actions that would cross the line. That conclusion, the rational conclusion that crossing the line is preferable to not crossing it, is the specific condition that makes the current moment categorically different from every previous near-line moment in the post-war period. Previous near-line moments were managed because the actors approaching the line concluded, at the critical moment, that the cost of crossing it exceeded the cost of the alternative. The current moment is different because the cost calculation has flipped. And it has flipped not through irrationality or miscalculation, but through the specific accumulation of pressures, constraints, and exhausted alternatives that the preceding analysis in this series has documented in detail. The prior context that makes this specific line crossing scenario world order reshaping rather than merely regionally catastrophic is the specific role that the line plays in the foundational architecture. The line is not a military threshold, though it has military dimensions. It is not an economic threshold, though its crossing produces severe economic consequences. It is a credibility threshold, the point at which the demonstrated gap between what the post-war order's primary guarantor has committed to prevent and what it has actually prevented becomes so large and so publicly visible that the credibility function of the entire deterrence architecture is destroyed. Deterrence architecture does not fail gradually. It fails suddenly and completely because deterrence depends on the belief that the committed response will follow the prohibited action. And when that belief is shattered by a visible failure, the entire deterrence structure loses its functional capacity simultaneously rather than incrementally. The media narrative is covering the current proximity to this line through the crisis management framework that has characterized conflict coverage throughout the post-war period. The diplomatic consultations, the emergency sessions, the carefully worded red line statements, the alliance solidarity declarations, all of that activity is genuine, and all of it reflects the sincere belief of the actors engaged in it that the crisis management tools being deployed are adequate to prevent the line's crossing. What the media narrative is not doing is explaining why, at this specific moment, those tools are less adequate than at any previous near-line moment. What the specific features of the current situation make the conventional crisis management approach insufficient, and what the world order reshaping scenario actually looks like in the concrete detail that makes its stakes comprehensible. That is the analytical contribution this video is designed to make. Now let us build the power map, because the line's crossing or non-crossing is ultimately a product of specific decisions by specific actors in specific decision-making environments. And understanding those environments with full precision is the foundation of everything that follows. Start with the actor, whose decision is the most immediate and the most compelled. Publicly, it is projecting strategic confidence, doctrinal clarity, and a commitment to its defined objectives that implies neither desperation nor the kind of calculation that a line crossing decision requires. That projection is the product of a sophisticated understanding of how public confidence affects both domestic political sustainability and external deterrence signaling. Strategically, what this actor is actually confronting is a decision landscape in which every available option carries severe downside risk and in which the conventional deterrence logic that the cost of crossing the line exceeds the cost of not crossing it has been reversed by the specific accumulation of pressures that the current moment represents. An actor that has concluded that all options are severely costly will not be deterred by additional cost imposition in the way that deterrence theory predicts, because the theory's behavioral model assumes a preference ordering in which survival and status quo maintenance rank above objective achievement. When that preference ordering has been disrupted by the specific conditions of the current moment, the deterrence mechanism loses its primary behavioral lever. The biggest constraint on this actor is not the cost of crossing the line. It is the uncertainty about whether crossing it produces the outcome it is intended to produce, and uncertainty about outcomes in a decision landscape where all options are costly does not prevent decisions. It shapes their timing and their form. Look at the United States. Washington's decision-making environment at the current line proximity is defined by three specific constraints that have not simultaneously operated at any previous near-line moment. The first is the analytical constraint, the failure, documented throughout this series, to assemble the cross-domain picture of the current situation that would produce a sufficiently urgent and specific assessment of the line proximity for the decision makers with the authority to respond to it. The second is the political constraint, the domestic environment in which every response option adequate to the current line proximity requires a political authorization that the existing coalition is not assembled to provide at the speed the proximity timeline demands. And the third is the credibility constraint, the accumulated gap between prior American commitments about what crossing specific thresholds would produce and what crossing those thresholds has actually produced. A gap that has progressively reduced the deterrent value of new American commitments about this specific line. All three constraints are simultaneously operative and mutually reinforcing, which makes the American decision-making environment at the current moment less capable of producing an adequate response than at any previous near-line proximity in this conflict's arc. Look at Russia. Russia's calculation at the current line proximity is driven by an assessment of two asymmetric risks that has consistently led to the same conclusion throughout this conflict's escalation arc. The first risk is that supporting actions that cross the line produces a full-spectrum American response that exceeds what the nuclear ceiling and the domestic political environment actually allow. A risk that Russia has consistently assessed as lower than American signaling suggests, based on its observation of American behavior at each previous threshold crossing moment. The second risk is that failing to support a partner that is approaching the line crossing produces a strategic defeat whose consequences for Russian credibility, strategic position, and domestic political stability are worse than the risks associated with the support. Russia's consistent conclusion that the second risk exceeds the first has been the primary driver of the external support escalation that has advanced the expansion sequence to its current stage. That conclusion has not been falsified by any development in the conflict's arc to date, and it will not be changed by rhetorical escalation of American warnings without a demonstrated willingness to impose costs that the domestic political environment has previously prevented. Look at China. At the current line proximity, China's decision is the most structurally consequential of any external actors, and it is being made with a clarity of strategic understanding that the Western analytical community has consistently underestimated. China understands the line's world order significance better than any other actor in the situation, because China is the primary beneficiary of one specific outcome of the line crossing scenario and the primary victim of a different specific outcome. The beneficial outcome is a post-crossing world in which American deterrence credibility has been catastrophically damaged, and the alternative international framework that China has been constructing gains the legitimacy and the adoption that the American-led framework's failure produces. The victimizing outcome is a post-crossing world in which the full war scenario's energy and financial system consequences have severely disrupted the Chinese economic growth, on which the Communist Party's domestic legitimacy depends. China is weighing those two outcomes against each other and against the cost of the circuit breaker intervention that could prevent the crossing. And the direction of that weighing, which has not yet resolved, is the single most consequential undecided question in international affairs at this specific moment. Look at the European allies, because their coherence at the current line proximity is one of the primary variables in the deterrence architecture whose credibility is supposed to make the crossing less attractive than it has currently become. European political coherence is more fragile than at any previous nearline moment, fractured by domestic political developments in key member states, by the fiscal unsustainability of current defense spending trajectories in several European economies, and by the divergent threat assessments that reflect the different geographic and economic exposures of northern and southern European governments. That fragmentation is not a peripheral concern. It is a central factor in the line-approaching actors' calculation, because a deterrence architecture whose European pillar is publicly fragmented has a lower aggregate credibility than the formal commitments of its member states suggest. And that credibility discount is itself one of the conditions that makes the line-crossing calculation more favorable than the deterrence architecture's designers intended. Now let us turn to the structural facts, the hard, verifiable realities that define what line crossing actually produces, and why the world order consequences are as severe as this analysis claims. Structural fact number one, the world order's foundational architecture rests on a specific and singular credibility assumption. The assumption that the primary guarantor's deterrence commitments are credible because they have never been comprehensively and publicly failed at the level that this specific line represents. The entire deterrence architecture, every alliance commitment, every security guarantee, every red line declaration, every statement that a specific action will produce a specific response, derives its behavioral effect from the accumulated credibility of prior commitments. That credibility is not inexhaustible. It is a stock that is drawn down by each instance of commitment non-performance and replenished by each instance of commitment performance. The current situation has been drawing down that credibility stock through a sequence of smaller commitment non-performances over the conflict's arc. The line represents the level at which the remaining stock drawn down by prior non-performances is insufficient to sustain the deterrence architecture's basic functioning. Crossing it does not reduce the stock incrementally, it exhausts it completely and simultaneously across every theater and every commitment relationship in the global deterrence architecture. Structural fact number two, the economic consequences of the line crossing scenario activate through three simultaneous mechanisms that compound each other in ways that make their combined effect more severe than any single mechanism would produce. The first mechanism is the direct disruption of the energy and trade infrastructure in the conflict's geographic theater and its adjacent regions. The second is the financial market repricing of global risk that the credibility architecture's collapse produces, a repricing that affects every asset class in every market simultaneously, because the deterrence architecture's credibility has been the foundational assumption of the risk models that have governed financial market behavior throughout the post-war period. And the third is the institutional breakdown of the multilateral economic governance mechanisms, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the Basel framework, whose functionality depends on the great power cooperation that the line crossing's political consequences destroy. The combination of these three mechanisms produces an economic disruption whose character is analogous not to 2008, but to the breakdown of the interwar economic order. A systematic rather than cyclical disruption that requires institutional reconstruction rather than policy stabilization to address. Structural fact number 3, the nuclear risk architecture of the line-crossing scenario is the factor that makes every other structural consequence more severe and less recoverable than historical precedent can illuminate. The lines crossing activates a specific nuclear risk dynamic that is distinct from the deliberate first-use scenario that nuclear deterrence theory is primarily designed to manage. The dynamic is one of mutual misperception under information uncertainty, a situation in which each nuclear-armed actor observing the other's behavior through a severely degraded communication and intelligence architecture reaches conclusions about the other's intentions that are more threatening than the other's actual intentions and takes actions to address those perceived threats that confirm the other's misperception in a self-reinforcing cycle. The Cuban Missile Crisis managed this dynamic successfully through a combination of exceptional decision-maker quality, functioning back-channel communication, and the specific intervention of actors on both sides who understood the dynamic and acted to interrupt it. The current conflict's communication architecture is more degraded, the decision-making quality is more constrained by domestic political environments, and the actors who would perform the interruption role are more compromised by their own involvement in the expansion sequence than their 1962 counterparts were. Structural fact number 4, the institutional consequences of the line crossing are not limited to the specific institutions that are most directly involved in managing the conflict. They cascade across the entire international institutional architecture through a mechanism of legitimacy contagion, the process through which an institution's demonstrated failure to perform its core function in one high-stakes instance reduces confidence in its capacity to perform that function in all subsequent instances. The United Nations Security Council, the International Court of Justice, the NPT framework, the arms control architecture, the international humanitarian law system, and the multilateral financial institutions all draw their authority partly from the expectation that they will function in high-stakes situations as well as routine ones. The line-crossing scenario is the high-stakes situation that tests that expectation, and the institutional failures it produces, the Security Council paralysis, the NPT framework's inability to prevent the proliferation cascade, the humanitarian law system's inability to enforce its norms in active conflict, are simultaneously specific failures and legitimacy-destroying demonstrations that cascade across every institution whose authority depends on the same foundational expectation. Structural fact number 5, the precedent effect of the line crossing is the most durable and the most globally consequential of the structural facts, because it operates across every subsequent international situation for as long as the post-crossing world retains the memory of what the crossing produced. The specific precedent established is not simply that a particular action was taken without being prevented. It is that the comprehensive deterrence architecture of the post-war order, with all of its military, economic, institutional, and normative components deployed simultaneously, was insufficient to prevent the action. That precedent changes the decision calculus of every actor in every situation where deterrence architecture is the primary mechanism of behavior modification, which is to say, every significant international security situation for the foreseeable future. A world in which that precedent has been established is a world in which the deterrence architecture has permanently lost the behavioral leverage that has been its primary contribution to post-war stability. From this point, 3 scenarios are possible. I want to walk through each with the full precision and specificity that the stakes of this moment demand. Scenario A is the world order reshaping path. the path on which the line is crossed, the deterrence architecture's credibility is comprehensively and simultaneously destroyed, and the international system enters a period of foundational restructuring whose character, duration, and outcome are determined by the specific power relationships and political forces that the crossing has empowered. This scenario does not produce a world without order. It produces a world whose order is being renegotiated from a position of catastrophic institutional damage under conditions of economic disruption, nuclear risk elevation, and great power competition that are less favorable to durable and just outcomes than the conditions under which the post-war order was constructed. The specific early warning signal of this scenario activating is the failure of the back-channel communication process to produce a specific and credible de-escalatory offer within the timeline that the line-approaching actor's decision process is operating on. A failure that will be visible to close observers of the communication pattern between the primary actors and their external supporters before it is visible in any public diplomatic development. Scenario B is the managed containment path. The best realistic outcome available within the current proximity, achievable not through the resolution of the underlying causes of the near-line situation, but through the construction of a specific de-escalatory framework that changes the cost-benefit calculation of the line-crossing decision with sufficient speed and sufficient credibility to produce a different decision within the available timeline. This scenario requires simultaneously a Chinese circuit breaker deployment of the comprehensive kind this series has described, an American political authorization for a response posture adjustment that goes beyond what the current domestic coalition has supported, and a diplomatic framework that addresses the minimum requirements of the actor facing the compelled decision without requiring it to accept an outcome that its domestic political situation cannot sustain. The demanding simultaneity of those requirements is why this scenario has not been produced at any previous nearline moment in this conflict's arc, and why achieving it at the current proximity, which is greater than at any previous moment, is more demanding still. It is achievable. Its achievement requires a quality of decision-making and a speed of political authorization that the current environments of the key actors make difficult but not impossible. Scenario C is the structural interruption wildcard, a development that changes the fundamental logic of the situation from outside the decision-making framework that the current proximity has established. The most structurally significant candidate remains a Chinese decision to deploy its circuit breaker capacity for its own strategic reasons. Specifically, the conclusion that the beneficial outcome of the line-crossing scenario is less certain and less valuable than the victimizing outcome is certain and costly. If China reaches that conclusion within the decision timeline available, and if it deploys its circuit breaker capacity in a form specific and credible enough to change the line-approaching actor's calculation, the wildcard scenario produces an outcome that is better for the international order than either alternative, and that positions China as the actor whose intervention preserved the order that America was unable to defend. That positioning is the strategic price of the circuit breaker, and it is a price the international order pays whether or not anyone in Washington explicitly agrees to pay it. Let me now bring this directly home, because the world order reshaping scenario connects to your daily life through channels that are not abstract and are not distant. The economic and financial channel is the most immediate. A deterrence architecture collapse produces financial market consequences within hours of the crossing. Consequences that translate within days into household energy cost increases, consumer price inflation, credit market tightening, and the specific economic hardship that accompanies a sudden and severe repricing of global risk. The magnitude of those consequences in the line crossing scenario exceeds any economic disruption of the post-war period, because it reflects not a cyclical shock, but a structural repricing of the foundational assumptions on which the global economy's risk architecture has been built. The institutional channel is where the consequences are felt most durably. International institutions that lose their legitimacy through a comprehensive deterrence failure do not recover it through subsequent reform or renewed commitment. They carry the damage into every subsequent challenge they are asked to manage, and the accumulated incompetence produced by that damage shapes the quality of international governance across every domain: health, environment, trade, security, for the generation that inherits the post-crossing world. The security channel reflects the consequences for the specific security arrangements that protect the countries whose governments are aligned with the post-war order. A deterrence architecture whose credibility has been destroyed must be rebuilt from the ground up under post post-crossing conditions of economic disruption, institutional damage, and great power competition that make the rebuilding more expensive, more contentious, and less likely to produce durable outcomes than the original construction was. The security costs of the post-crossing period fall on the populations of every country, whose security depends on the functioning of deterrence commitments that are now demonstrably less credible than they were before the crossing. The human channel is the most direct and the most morally urgent. The people who bear the most severe consequences of the world order reshaping scenario are not the decision makers whose choices produce it, not the strategists whose frameworks describe it, and not the governments whose policies failed to prevent it. They are the civilian populations of the regions most directly affected by the crossing's military, economic, and institutional consequences. Populations whose well-being, security, and life prospects are determined by the quality of the international order in ways that the decision-makers responsible for that order have an obligation to acknowledge and to act upon. My read on the current moment is this: the line is real, the proximity is real. The conditions that have produced the proximity are more fully assembled and more resistant to the conventional management tools being deployed than any official posture reflects. The world order reshaping scenario is not the most probable outcome in absolute probability terms, but it is more probable than at any previous moment in this conflict's arc, and more probable than the managed containment scenario's preconditions are currently assembled to prevent. The window for prevention is open, but narrowing at a rate that the institutional response processes of the key actors are not currently matching. Short term, the most critical variable is the Chinese decision, whether Beijing concludes that the circuit breaker deployment serves its interests better than the alternatives, and whether that conclusion is reached within the timeline that the decision process of the line approaching actor is operating on. Long term, the outcome of this specific moment will be assessed as the defining test of whether the post-war international order retains the foundational vitality to manage its most severe stress, or whether the current moment marks the beginning of the transition to a post-order world whose character will be determined by forces whose direction no current actor fully controls. What happens if this line is crossed? The world order that has kept great power conflict from consuming the planet for 80 years does not survive the crossing in recognizable form. What replaces it is not determined by this analysis, not determined by any government's planning, and not determined by any institutional framework currently in place. It is determined by the specific power relationships, political forces, and historical accidents that the crossing produces and empowers. That uncertainty, the uncertainty about what follows a world order collapse, is not a reason for fatalism. It is the strongest possible reason for the urgency, the analytical clarity, and the political courage that preventing the crossing requires. The window is open, the mechanism is visible, the decision is close, and the analysis that makes all of that legible before the events that confirm it have already occurred is what this channel exists to provide. If you want to continue receiving this kind of structural, precise, and unflinching analysis before the events that confirm it have occurred, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so the next analysis reaches you when it matters most. News changes fast, structures change slow. Know the difference, and that is precisely what we are here for.